we have Jim Fine.
Well, thank you very much, Shannon, and Farshad, thank you for mentioning Morgan Schuster. I think you must be the umpteenth Iranian who has mentioned him. I think most of us in the United States have no idea who he was, but Iranians remember, and he is often cited as the example of what should happen between Iran and the United States. Of course, people in Iran also remember 1953 and MI5 and the CIA and Mossadegh, but they also remember those good examples, and so many people that I've spoken to express the hope that that could happen again. Well, I'm delighted to have a chance to be with you all today. Thank you to the organizers, thank you to FCNL and to the library for putting this on. We had a lovely 3-hour drive from my hometown of Bristol, Pennsylvania, exactly the amount of time it takes us to drive to Washington, D.C., which I had begun to consider as a suburb of Bristol, so I'm glad to include New Haven in the greater Bristol area. And it was a lovely drive and a lovely day to be with you. We found an Irish pub around the corner where there was a Premier League game on, and everybody was dressed in Arsenal jerseys. I couldn't believe it. But they said it's a licensed Arsenal pub, so if you're an Arsenal fan, it's just around the corner. Well, in 10 minutes, I wanted to go back to the beginning, to talk about the origins of the, and I will say so-called, Iran nuclear crisis, because I think it's a crisis not entirely, certainly not entirely, but largely the product of Western and especially US fear and animosity towards the Islamic Republic, sustained to some extent by Iranian actions, but sustained to a greater extent by misunderstanding and outright misrepresentation of the facts. So go back to the last days of the Shah. When the Iranian Revolution occurred in '79, the Pahlavi regime had been embarked on a very ambitious nuclear power program. The Shah wanted to have the latest technology, wanted to deal with some of the pollution problems in Tehran and other areas, and wanted to have 23 nuclear power plants, one of which, Bushehr, was 80% complete. And Iran had given more than $1 billion to the French company Eurodif that was building it in return for 10% of the uranium fuel produced by that French reactor. Iran had no intention to enrich uranium itself under the Shah. So what happens? The revolution occurs. Oh, and by the way, I can remember this. One of the advantages of getting old is you can remember things that happened almost 40 years ago. I once had an FCNL intern. It was just a delight to work with her. Kate Gould, she's currently doing my job at FCNL. And together, I think we were the perfect team. I told her what happened 40 years ago. She told me what happened 40 minutes ago. And we were really on top of everything. So I need somebody like that now, too. But at any rate, the Iranian Islamic Republic comes to power. Initially, they are not interested in a nuclear power program. They gut the budget and the staff of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. And it looks as though they're not going to go anywhere with it. But by 1981, they had changed their minds, and they were embarked on a much less ambitious plan. They wanted to complete Bushehr, the reactor that they had invested in. It was 80% complete with German help. And they wanted to operate that and the Tehran research reactor for medical isotopes and research. So they invite in the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and they ask them to do a technical evaluation, and they ask for their recommendations for technical assistance. Of course, Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there was no hint at this time that Iran had ever violated any provision of the NPT. So the IAEA came back with recommendations to complete the Bushehr reactor, to provide Iran on a commercial basis with uranium fuel, and to support the program that it had a right to under the NPT. What happens? The US goes ballistic. The Reagan administration by 1984 was saying in public, and they had, even Carter and before, Carter and Reagan earlier had also been saying in private that they did not want to see any nuclear technology and assistance to Iran, despite there was no evidence that Iran had violated any provision of the NPT. So what does Iran do in response? They decide they're going to move to a policy of self-sufficiency. They are, because they cannot purchase enriched uranium for fuel on the international market, they are going to develop the ability to enrich themselves. Had we gone by the provisions of the NPT and recognized the Islamic regime's ability to have a peaceful nuclear program, the issue of enrichment may never have arisen. So at any rate, the Iranians are pushed into the shadows, and they begin a semi-surreptitious effort, not unknown to the intelligence agencies in the West, but a surreptitious effort to procure the necessary equipment, including from the notorious AQ Khan network, from whom they bought centrifuges. But interestingly, they declined to buy the design for a nuclear weapon or any of the components necessary for a weapons program, even though they were on offer by the Khan network. Interesting, may give pause to the conclusion that Iran has had long-term ambitions to pursue a nuclear weapons program. At any rate, their policy in their program in the shadows did lead them to violate the NPT. They failed to notify the IAEA of purchases of uranium from China in 1991, and they had an undisclosed centrifuge lab developing, experimenting, being able to operate a centrifuge in Tehran. Western intelligence agencies informed the IAEA, and the IAEA in November 2003 issues a report that outs Iran's violations of the NPT. The report said, however, there was, quote, no evidence that undeclared material and activities related to a weapons program existed. And they made clear that Iran conducted only small-scale enrichment experiments using centrifuges for brief periods in 1999 and 2002, and carried out another very small-scale experiment with laser enrichment technology. How does that get reported back in the mainstream media of the United States? Let me take what I think is the most egregious example, and it comes from NPR, All Things Considered, on November 13th, 2003, when Melissa Block, introducing the program, says that the IAEA is about to meet to, quote, decide what to do about Iran's nuclear weapons program, unquote. Even though the report itself said there is no evidence that undeclared material and activities related to a weapons program. And she's also added that the report contained more damning evidence of an extensive nuclear weapons infrastructure. No language like that in the report at all. Then Mike Schuster comes in with a summary of the report that describes enrichment of both uranium and plutonium that, quote, had taken place over the past 18 years, all in secret. Suddenly, from those brief periods in 99 and 2002 in the report, Americans are given the idea that Iran has been secretly enriching uranium for 18 years. Well, if you can't trust NPR, who can you trust? Whom can you trust? I usually turn, when they are available, to former Israeli generals and intelligence agents from Israel. Thanks to FCNL, I had an opportunity to meet retired Israeli Brigadier General Shlomo Brom in December of 2008 at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, the Jaffe Center in Tel Aviv, on a study tour with Churches for Middle East Peace. And Brom immediately allayed one misgiving that has been bandied about, the idea of the mad mullahs who will sacrifice their population simply to annihilate the Jewish state and are hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon so they can annihilate Israel regardless of the consequences. To the contrary, Braun said that the real threat is not an Iranian nuclear bomb on Tel Aviv. The way they handle themselves is completely rational. That's the assessment of a man who was the director of strategic planning for the Israel Defense Forces. Iran suffered horrific casualties during the war with Iraq and does not want to come anywhere close to that experience again. Even if Iran were to have a nuclear weapon, which it is showing no signs of developing, it could be deterred, Braun said, by a nuclear balance of terror. So at the time, there was a question of how much support is there for the negotiations, and Braun was saying then that there was wide support in Israel despite what political leaders were saying for negotiations with Iran. Fast forward to 2012, and Braun is speaking before the J Street Pro-Israel, Pro-Peace Lobby Convention in Washington, and his theme is the degree to which the discourse on Iran is plagued with emotions and with a lot of disinformation. The unconfirmed claim that Iran currently has a nuclear weapons program is something that Braun dismissed, along with pointing out that both the U.S. and Israeli intelligence have concurred in saying that there is no evidence that Iran is currently moving forward on a nuclear weapons program. Finally, Braun is still very active, published an article in the Center for American Progress just a few days ago, and his assessment at the moment is that the current possible deal, the one that looks like it's emerging with Iran, appears to be an acceptable package that gives the United States enough confidence that Iran would be deterred from breaking out during the time the agreement is valid. Indeed, he says the main weakness of the agreement is the limited time in which it is enforced, but there is no better alternative to this agreement. Past experience shows that a collapse of the negotiations would threaten the elements of the Iranian regime that believes the West's real intentions is to weaken Iran and eventually bring about a regime change. According to these hardliners in Iran, Iran would therefore have no alternative but to adopt a resistance economy despite increased sanctions and withstand all external pressure. These moves in turn would mean that Iran would resume its full nuclear program, operate more and more advanced centrifuges, and accumulate a larger quantity of low-enriched uranium. It does not necessarily mean that Iran would immediately start work towards military nuclear capability, but rather that Iran's breakout time would become shorter and shorter, eventually becoming a one-screw rotation away from a nuclear weapon. A very sound, very rational, very careful assessment by someone whose credentials can hardly be challenged. So where's the body to go for information? There is a lot out there. If you followed the story of the Iraq weapons inspections between 1991 and 2003, you would have been able to glean from the mainstream press, if you looked in the right places, that Saddam had nothing left. The UN weapons inspections had cleaned him out. The nuclear program, the chemical program, the biological program. He might have had a couple of kitchen cabinet laboratories tucked away somewhere, but it was clear on the public record that he had no program of weapons of mass destruction. And yet the country was so easily misled into believing the worst and launching the disastrous attack against Iraq. Well, there is good information out there on this issue. First, if you want to follow what's going on, you should attend to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee's website, AIPAC.org. AIPAC put 15,000 lobbyists on Capitol Hill the day after Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech, lobbying for legislation that would have scuttled the negotiations. So if you want to know what's going on, you should check the AIPAC website. If you want good arguments against the effort to stop diplomacy, Americans for Peace Now is doing a superb job. I used to tell, for the communications people at FCNL would say, the president's going to deliver a speech tomorrow night. Would you write a response to him today? And I would say, what? But I haven't heard the speech yet. And they would say, well, that shouldn't matter. You ought to know what he's going to say. Well, I didn't think that was possible. But the day before Netanyahu spoke in Congress, Laura Friedman of Americans for Peace Now published an 11-point rebuttal, and it turned out she hit every argument that Netanyahu made in his speech. They have done yeoman work in sorting out the fact from the fiction, so I'd recommend peacenow.org. Technical support, the Arms Control Association, armscontrol.org. Excellent, unbiased information about the negotiations and the agreement. I can't fail to mention the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is an important part of the coalition of organizations supporting diplomacy. And last but not least, the National Iranian American Council, a group very much concerned with human rights violations and democracy in Iran, but a group also very strongly convinced that negotiations and an agreement is not only the way to check Iran's nuclear program, but it's also the way best suited to opening up the future for reform inside Iran. So thank you very much.